He bought a dying horse for just $2, but what happened next left an entire town speechless. When Mason Cole spent $2 lonely on a half-dead horse no one wanted, he didn't know he was saving a life, or that the broken creature would lead him into the most unexpected comeback the town had ever seen. Their story began in silence, and ended in something close to a miracle. The spring market in northern Wyoming always carried a smell of trampled dust, old leather, and resignation, like a place where both animals and people came to learn the true weight of being unwanted. Mason Cole walked through the muddy aisles without looking at anyone, shoulders tucked into the faded denim jacket he had worn since before the lawsuit took everything he owned. The world seemed louder these days, the auctioneer's voice sharp as metal, the chatter of ranchers turning into the low hum of judgment that followed him everywhere. Yet Mason kept walking, boots scraping the ground as though he were pushing through water, not dirt. He wasn't planning to buy anything. He hardly had the money to buy groceries. But something, perhaps habit, perhaps the ache of missing the life he once had led him back to the horse market. Rows of strong bay geldings and sleek mares lined the pens, catching the sun with coats brushed smooth for sale. He didn't stop at any of them. His feet led him instead to the far corner, the quiet patch of shade where no one cared to stand. There, curled on a pile of dirty straw, lay the horse no one bothered to name. Its ribs rose like sharp branches, each breath a trembling negotiation with pain. The coat, once chestnut maybe, had dulled into a grayish film of neglect. Flies clung around its eyes. Its legs were tucked under, as if it no longer believed it deserved to stand. For a moment, Mason thought it was dead, just another animal waiting to be hauled off for rendering. But then the horse's ear twitched, a barely there movement that felt more like a whisper than a sign of life. He stepped closer. The smell hit him first. Sour sweat, dried blood, fear. A smell he recognized too well from injured wildlife rescues he'd seen growing up. The kind that made your chest tighten, even if you weren't the one hurting. The horse's eyes opened a slit, revealing a clouded, exhausted gaze that struggled to focus. And when it finally caught sight of Mason, something in the man shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, just a quiet, internal tightening, like a cord pulled taut in the dark. Behind him, a voice barked, "You looking at that bag of bones, Cole?" Frank Donovan, the trader who'd brought in the dying horse, leaned against the fence with that familiar smirk of someone who'd never lost a thing he cared about. "A waste of space. Couldn't even get $1 for it. Better off putting it down." A few ranchers laughed. Their boots scraped, spurs clinked, a soundtrack Mason had grown used to since the day he'd lost his farm. Bankruptcy had made him invisible in some ways, but the town enjoyed reminding him he was still a spectacle. A cautionary tale. Mason didn't answer. He crouched beside the horse, slow enough not to scare it, not that it had enough strength to react. The horse flinched anyway, as though expecting another blow. His hand hovered over its muzzle for a second, before finally resting lightly against the warm, trembling skin. Beneath his fingertips, he felt a faint pulse, not strong, not steady, but stubborn. "What happened to you?" Mason whispered, though the horse couldn't understand the words. Maybe the question was meant for himself. Loss recognized loss. Frank spat into the dirt. "If you want that thing, I'll give it to you for $2. Might as well get myself a coffee out of this joke." The men around him chuckled, nudging each other. Mason heard them the same way you hear a storm in the distance, present but unimportant. His focus stayed on the horse's flickering breath, the way its nostrils quivered as if it were fighting to stay tethered to this world. No animal deserved to die in a place like this, surrounded by ridicule. He reached into his wallet. There were $4 bills inside, folded so many times they felt soft as cloth. He slid out 2. "You're kidding," Frank snorted. $2 for that?" "For this," Mason said quietly. When the trader snatched the bills, the laughter grew louder. Mocking, disbelieving, cruel. But Mason didn't look at any of them. He gently slid his arms under the horse's head, lifting just enough to adjust its position. The animal's eye fluttered open again, and for a heartbeat, a faint glimmer, fear or trust or simply the desire to survive, passed between them. A fragile moment. But moments build stories, even the quiet ones that look like nothing from afar. He stood, wiped the mud from his palms, and walked toward his rusty trailer. It would be a struggle to load the horse. It would be a struggle to keep it alive. But something inside Mason felt steadier than it had in years. He tightened the frayed rope on the back gate, turned, and walked back toward the horse with a slow, determined stride. As he reached down to lift the animal's head once more, the sky darkened slightly, clouds rolling over the early afternoon sun, as if Wyoming itself were holding its breath. Dustwalker didn't have that name yet. In this moment, he was simply a creature on the edge of life. Mason touched the horse's cheek. "Let's go home," he murmured. And as he prepared to lift the weakened body from the straw, the first drop of rain struck the dirt at his feet. Soft, cold, and signaling the beginning of the storm that would follow them into the night. The first drop of rain darkened the dirt at Mason's boots, then another, until the sky released a thin curtain of cold spring drizzle. It wasn't the loud kind of storm yet, just a quiet, creeping one, the kind that made everything feel heavier. Mason slid his arms under the frail horse, lifting slowly, adjusting his stance as the animal's weight shifted unexpectedly. Dustwalker, though still unnamed, gave a small grunt of discomfort, but not resistance. It was as if the horse had surrendered to whatever came next, trusting Mason simply because there was no one else left. The trailer groaned as Mason laid the horse inside, the wood soft from years of Wyoming rain and neglect. He tied a loose rope around what was left of its halter, though he doubted the animal had enough strength to move at all. The rain thickened, tapping the metal roof like impatient fingers. Mason climbed into the truck, turned the key, and waited for the reluctant engine to cough to life. When it finally did, he pulled onto the dirt road leading home, a road he once traveled with pride, hauling hay, not desperation. But tonight, he drove with a strange calm settling inside him, as if the decision to save something weak had quieted a storm of his own. The rain turned into sheets by the time he reached the property. The barn, old, skeletal, barely standing, looked smaller than he remembered. He backed the trailer as close as he could, then stepped out into the downpour. Mud swallowed his boots almost to the ankle. He wrenched open the trailer door and saw the horse shivering, not from fear, but from the cold dampness soaking into its bones. "Easy," Mason murmured. His voice had softened around animals over the years, even when it had hardened everywhere else. He shifted the horse's weight, guiding it slowly down the ramp. The halter strap slid between his fingers, slick from the rain and worn thin, but he kept his grip steady. Each step the animal took was fragile, uncertain. By the time they reached the barn, the rain had turned into a fierce drumming overhead, wind pushing against the loose boards until they rattled like old shutters in a ghost town. Inside the barn, It was dark and drafty. The place smelled of stale hay, wet earth, and the faint memory of better days. Mason kicked aside an old bucket, cleared a corner, and layered fresh straw, what little he had left, into a makeshift bed. He lowered the horse gently onto it, careful not to jar its injured hip. It let out a soft, low groan, a sound that pierced deeper than any cry for help. Mason fetched a rag from an old tack chest and soaked it in warm water from a kettle he'd heated in the house earlier. He cleaned the horse's wounds slowly, wiping away dried mud and old scars. He didn't talk much. Silence felt more respectful. The animal's breathing was uneven, but at least it was breathing. He made sure it had water within reach and placed a handful of hay nearby, not expecting it to eat, but wanting it to know the offer was there. The storm intensified, lightning tearing the sky open for brief, bright moments. Each flash illuminated the horse's sunken face, its eyes half closed, yet alert enough to follow Mason's movements. He sat down beside it on an overturned feed bucket, elbows on his knees, head hanging low. For the first time in a long while, he felt the kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical work. It was the weight of being responsible for something fragile again, a responsibility he'd thought he had lost the right to carry after losing his farm and everything tied to his identity. Hours passed like that, rain beating rhythmically against the roof. Mason caught himself nodding off before jerking awake each time the horse shifted. He didn't want to miss anything. Not tonight. Not when life was this fragile, resting in the straw, like a question no one dared to answer. Sometime near dawn, the rain softened, turning into a whisper against the metal roof. The cold seeped deeper into the barn, and Mason felt it settle into his bones. He stood, stretched the stiffness from his back, and grabbed an old blanket from a trunk by the wall. He draped it carefully over the horse, tucking the edges near its neck. The animal shivered once, then stilled. "You made it through the night," Mason whispered, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to the horse or to himself. The faintest light of morning crept through the cracks in the barn's boards, casting thin, golden lines across the straw. Dust motes drifted through the air, soft as ash. The horse's ear flicked. Mason's breath caught. It wasn't much, but it was something. A tiny sign of resilience. Maybe even hope. He stepped outside to grab more water from the pump, feeling the dirt soften beneath his boots. The world smelled fresh after the storm, cold but strangely clean. When he returned to the barn, he paused at the doorway. The horse was looking at him. Not fully upright, not fully alert, but its head was lifted, barely an inch above the straw, and its eyes were open, following him with a faint spark that hadn't been there hours before. Not trust yet, but curiosity. A question. Mason stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle between them. His chest tightened, not with grief this time, but with something gentler. "All right," he said softly. "Let's see what the day brings." The light widened across the barn floor as the sun slowly climbed, and Mason took a step toward the horse, the first small step into whatever came next, into the long road of horse rehabilitation and emotional healing neither of them knew they were about to walk together. And in that delicate silence, the story of the man and the half-dead horse continued into its second day, as the storm left behind a world washed clean enough for 2 second chances to begin. The morning light slid slowly across the barn floor, widening until it brushed against the horse's cheek like a cautious hand. Mason set the fresh bucket of water down, wiping the cold from his palms as he stepped inside. The air carried that after-storm stillness, quiet, damp, holding the faint scent of wet timber. He wasn't sure what to expect. Creatures this weak sometimes slipped away in the earliest hours, leaving nothing but an impression in the straw and a silence that felt too large. But the horse lifted its head again, just slightly, as if acknowledging his return. For a moment, Mason froze. It wasn't the simple rise of a dying animal clinging to reflex. It felt more deliberate, more aware. The horse's dark, tired eyes locked onto him, following him with a slow curiosity that hadn't existed the day before. It wasn't trust yet, not even acceptance, but something in between, a small crack where light managed to get in. "Well," Mason murmured, stepping closer. "That's something." He knelt beside it, careful not to rush. Animals in recovery often panicked when movement felt too sudden. He'd learned that years ago when helping neighbors with injured calves or orphaned foals. The faint tremble in the horse's nostrils told him it was watching, thinking, maybe even trying to understand the strange human who had traded 2 worn dollar bills for its broken body. A soft breeze slipped in through the gaps in the boards, brushing strands of straw across the floor. Mason dipped the rag into warm water and began cleaning the horse's neck, wiping away dried sweat and dirt that clung stubbornly to its coat. The animal didn't pull away. Its breaths were slow, shallow, but steady enough to quiet the fear that had been gripping Mason's chest since the storm. "You want a name?" he asked quietly. "Or are we not there yet?" The horse blinked, not offering an opinion. Mason chuckled under his breath, a sound that surprised him with how natural it felt. It had been a long time since anything had made him smile without effort. He finished tending the wounds, noticing the horse's breathing grow steadier with each careful touch. Progress in small increments, the kind that mattered most in veterinary care and long-term animal wellness. He stood and stretched, then stepped outside to pour out old rainwater from a rusted trough. When he returned, the horse's head lifted slightly higher, its ears angled toward him. Not flinching, not fearful, just attentive. "I see you," Mason whispered, not sure why the words came out the way they did. For years, he himself had felt unseen, reduced to whispers, rumors, and the lingering label of failure. Now, in this dark barn, a frail creature was watching him, as though trying to piece him together. Something unspoken passed between them, a fragile bridge built from quiet observation and the thin thread of survival. As the morning deepened, Mason worked around the barn, patching a broken board, sweeping away leaves blown in during the storm, stacking what little hay he had left. The horse followed his movements with its eyes, turning its head every so often as if making sure he was still there. Mason felt it like a weight and a comfort all at once. "You really are stubborn," Hichun muttered softly, noticing how the horse kept fighting to stay upright even while lying down. "Guess we have that in common." By midday, clouds drifted back across the sky, shading the barn in a cool gray. The temperature dropped, and the horse shivered. Mason fetched another old blanket and draped it over the animal, then pulled a stool beside it. The wooden seat creaked under him as he settled in, rubbing warmth back into his hands. "Let me tell you something," he said, leaning forward. "Most folks around here think I'm a lost cause." The horse blinked slowly, as if encouraging him to continue. "My farm fell apart. Not because I didn't work it hard enough. Life just decides things sometimes." His voice softened, the words drifting out into the cool air like smoke from a dying fire. "You know what it's like. The world giving up on you before you even get a say." The horse stirred slightly, its muzzle brushing the straw. Mason exhaled, feeling something loosen inside him. After a long pause, he reached out, letting his fingers hover over the space between them before resting gently against the horse's cheek. This time, the animal didn't just tolerate the touch. It leaned imperceptibly into it. A barely there gesture, but unmistakably intentional. A shiver went through Mason, not from cold, but from the quiet realization that something had shifted. Recognition. The horse had finally seen him not as a stranger, but as the one who stayed through the storm. "There you go," Mason whispered. "I'm right here." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. The barn darkened momentarily as a cloud passed overhead, and Mason stood to light a lantern. Its glow filled the rough wooden space with a gentle warmth, softening the edges of everything it touched. The horse's eyes reflected the light, seeming brighter now. Tired still, yes, but no longer hollow. "That's a good sign," Mason said, letting hope slip carefully into his voice. "Maybe tomorrow we try sitting up a bit. No pressure." He grabbed his jacket from a nail on the wall and slung it over a beam to dry. The day wasn't over, but the worst of the night's fear had passed. In its place was a sense of possibility, small, humble, and as fragile as the creature lying before him. Mason reached for the empty feed bucket, turning it over in his hands before setting it down again. "Let's keep going," he said softly. The horse blinked in slow acknowledgement, a quiet answer to a quiet promise. And as the lantern flame flickered in the dim barn, the fragile thread between man and horse pulled just a little tighter, ready to carry them both toward whatever the next morning might bring. The next morning arrived quietly, a soft Wyoming dawn stretching itself across the horizon with the patience of a world that didn't rush for anyone. Mason stepped into the barn while rubbing the sleep from his eyes, expecting to find the horse in the same fragile stillness as the night before. But something felt different the moment he opened the door. The air held a faint tension, like the pause before a bowstring releases. Dustwalker was awake. Not simply breathing, not barely surviving. Truly awake. His ears flicked toward Mason as soon as he entered, and for the first time, the horse didn't look like he was drifting between worlds. His gaze was clearer, heavier with awareness, and almost determined. "Well," Mason said softly, placing the water bucket down. "You look like you've made up your mind about something." He walked closer, watching the horse's muscles tremble under the worn blanket. Dustwalker shifted, testing his weight the way a long-injured man might test a leg he wasn't sure he trusted anymore. Mason knelt beside him, brushing the coarse mane away from his eyes. "You don't have to rush it," he murmured. "We'll get there." But as if the words were permission rather than caution, Dustwalker exhaled a sharp, shaky breath and pushed his front legs forward. Mason's heart slammed against his ribs. He stayed absolutely still, not wanting to interrupt the fragile decision unfolding in front of him. Dustwalker tried again, this time with more intention. His hooves scraped against the straw, and the muscles along his ribs tightened like twisted rope. He lifted himself an inch, then two, only to collapse back down, breath shuddering from exhaustion. "Easy," Mason whispered. His voice carried no disappointment, only a steady warmth. That wasn't a failure. He reached for the horse's neck, running his hand down the sharp outline of bone. The horse leaned into the touch for a moment before refocusing on the ground beneath him. Dustwalker wasn't done. Something in his eyes, something stubborn, something born of instinct or will, kept pulling him upward. This time the horse tucked his hind legs under and pushed harder than before. Slowly, trembling like a leaf in the wind, he rose. Front legs first, then back legs, his body swaying dangerously as he fought gravity and weakness at once. His knees dipped, threatened to buckle, but the horse held on with a determination Mason felt in his own chest. Dustwalker stood, frail, uneven, unsteady, but fully on his feet. Mason didn't breathe. He didn't dare. The sight was too fragile, too sacred, like watching a newborn foal learning the idea of living for the very first time. The barn felt suddenly warmer, filled with the rising glow of morning sunlight pushing through the gaps in the boards. "You did it," Mason whispered. "You're standing." Dustwalker wavered, head lowering as he tried to balance his weight. Mason stepped closer but kept his hands at his sides, letting the horse find stability without interference. This wasn't a moment for saving. It was a moment for letting go. Letting Dustwalker reclaim something he'd lost. After several seconds, the shaking steadied. The horse took a breath. A deeper, fuller breath than any he had taken since arriving. And for the first time, Mason saw not the dying creature from the market, but the ghost of what Dustwalker might one day become. "Look at you," Mason murmured. "You're not done, are you?" Dustwalker flicked an ear at the sound of his voice, then took one tiny step forward. Just one. But it echoed in the barn with the weight of a miracle. Mason's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something gentler. Something like pride, or maybe admiration. It had been years since he felt that about anything. He reached for the hay net he'd hung near the stall wall, pulling down a handful of dried strands and offering them gently. Dustwalker sniffed the hay, hesitated, then took a weak but deliberate bite. Mason's eyes softened. Progress didn't always roar. Sometimes it looked like a starving creature making a single choice to live. Outside, the morning breeze picked up, carrying with it the quiet hum of rural community life. Distant cattle, a pickup engine, the soft rumble of Wyoming's endless wind. It made Mason feel oddly grounded, as if he belonged to something again after being adrift for so long. "You keep going like this," he said softly, "and you'll walk out of here on your own." Dustwalker shifted, adjusting his stance. For a moment his body shook so violently Mason stepped forward instinctively. But the horse steadied himself again, breath coming out in long, determined exhales. Mason wondered whether he should bring in a vet soon, maybe get proper equine recovery support. But he hesitated. Right now, what Dustwalker needed most wasn't medicine. It was presence. "Let's try something," Mason said, lowering his tone. He moved to the horse's shoulder and placed one hand there, guiding gently. "Shift your weight a bit. Yeah, just like that." Dustwalker leaned subtly into the pressure, trusting Mason's cue. The connection between them, thin as thread but strong enough to hold, pulled a little tighter. When Dustwalker finally allowed himself to rest, folding back to the straw with slow, tired dignity, Mason crouched down beside him. He exhaled a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That was enough for today," he whispered. "More than enough." Dustwalker's eyelids drooped, but before they closed completely, he looked at Mason, not with fear, not with confusion, but with something resembling acknowledgement. Recognition. A quiet understanding passed between them, one that didn't need words. Mason stayed there until Dustwalker fell asleep. breathing slow and even. Only then did he step outside, letting the cold morning air fill his lungs. He felt lighter somehow, as if Dustwalker's first stand had helped him rise a little too. The day stretched ahead, full of uncertainties but also full of something new, something that felt suspiciously like hope. Hope was a quiet thing. So quiet that Mason almost didn't recognize it at first. But over the next 2 days, Dustwalker's progress grew steadier. A little more weight on his legs, a little more clarity in his eyes, a little less fear in the space between breath and movement. Mason tried not to expect too much. Life had taught him that expectations were dangerous things. Still, each morning when he stepped into the barn, the horse greeted him with a faint lift of the head, as if acknowledging they were no longer simply surviving. They were inching toward living again. By the 4th morning, the sun rose clean and warm, washing the property in soft gold. Mason stepped out with a coffee mug warming his hand, listening to the wind slide across the dry grass. For the first time in what felt like ages, he didn't wake with that heavy pressure of dread, a pressure he'd grown far too used to since losing the farm. His mind felt clearer. His breath felt easier. And all because one stubborn, broken animal had decided to stand up and fight. He didn't hear the truck until it was already close. The rumbling engine cut through the quiet like a warning, sending a ripple of tension down Mason's spine. A white Ford pickup, older model, dented at the bumper, rolled to a stop near the barn. Mason's jaw tightened. There was only one person in the county who drove that truck like it was stolen from its own will. Frank Donovan climbed out, boots hitting the dirt with a confidence that always bordered on arrogance. He wore a smug grin, the same one he had at the market, like life owed him something for showing up. "Mornin', Cole," Frank said, adjusting his belt buckle. "Heard you've been playing doctor with that dying horse of mine." Mason didn't respond right away. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting the heat settle into his chest before he spoke. "He's not dying anymore." Frank smirked. "So they say." Word had gotten around. Small towns moved gossip faster than any insurance claim ever could. A few neighbors had glimpsed Mason walking in and out of the barn with purpose, and the rumor mill spun from there. People liked stories, especially ones about the guy who fell from grace suddenly pulling himself upright again. Frank walked toward the barn door, hands in his pockets. "Mind if I take a look?" "I mind," Mason said. But Frank was already pushing the door open. Inside, Dustwalker lifted his head. He wasn't standing this morning, not yet, but his posture was different. Alert. Aware. Frank let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. You actually got him alive." Mason stepped between them. He didn't touch Frank, didn't raise his voice, just positioned himself like a gate that wasn't meant to be opened. "What do you want?" Frank pulled a folded wad of bills from his shirt pocket and fanned them out. "I'll give you $100 for him." Mason stared. "You sold him to me for $2. "Sure," Frank shrugged. "But that was when he was worth $2. The horse is worth more now. I'm willing to buy back what's mine." "He's not yours," Mason said. Frank's grin sharpened. "Everything's negotiable out here, including principle." Dustwalker shifted behind him, ears pinned back. Mason felt the horse's tension as if it were his own heartbeat being pressed into his ribs. Something inside him, something long dormant, tightened, anchoring him where he stood. "He's not for sale," Mason said quietly. Frank laughed, not kindly. "Come on, Cole. You're broke. Everybody knows it. You don't have the resources to take care of livestock. Hell, you barely have the money to fix this barn. Take the cash. Fix your fence. Pay off some rural property taxes before they come knocking again." A flicker of shame crossed Mason's face, not because Frank was wrong, but because he knew the man enjoyed saying it. But shame didn't move him this time. He looked at Dustwalker, this half-dead creature who had fought to stand, who had leaned into his touch not because he was strong, but because he was gentle. Something in that memory steadied him like a hand at his back. "I said no." Frank's jaw twitched. "Why keep him? He ain't going to win you anything. Just a walking bill of veterinary care." Mason took a slow step forward, closing the distance. "Because he's not done, and neither am I." For the first time, Frank's smirk faltered. He looked at Mason as if seeing a different man than the one the town whispered about. Someone who had found a spine again. Someone who had chosen something with full-hearted conviction. Frank shoved the bills back into his pocket, annoyed. "You'll regret turning down money when you're running empty." Mason's voice dropped, steady as Wyoming stone. "I'm already empty, and I'm still saying no." Silence coated the barn. Dustwalker breathed steadily behind him, the sound soft, grounding. Frank stared a moment longer, calculating something dark and petty behind his eyes, then finally turned around. "You've got more pride than sense, Cole," he muttered, climbing back into the truck. The engine roared to life, spitting gravel as he backed out and disappeared down the road. Dustwalker's ears relaxed as the sound faded, and Mason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He stepped inside the stall, kneeling beside the horse and placing a calming hand on his neck. "He's gone," he whispered. Dustwalker exhaled through his nostrils, a quiet huff that felt almost like trust. "You're safe," Mason added. The words felt deeper than reassurance. They felt like a promise, one he wasn't about to break, no matter how thin the money ran or how fragile the road became. He didn't know how long this journey of emotional resilience would be, or whether he had the tools to finish it. But he knew this. He wasn't giving Dustwalker up. Not now. Not ever. The Wyoming afternoon stretched quiet after Frank's truck disappeared down the road. Mason leaned against the barn door, feeling the tension in his chest untangling one slow breath at a time. Dustwalker lowered his head into the straw again, calmer now, as if somehow sensing that the threat, whatever it meant in an animal's world, had passed. But the wind carried a strange undertone, a restless hum, the kind that made fences creak and dogs grow uneasy. Mason stepped outside and looked toward the horizon. Thick clouds gathered like an army marching across the sky, bruised purple at the edges. Wyoming storms had a way of arriving without invitation, tearing through the land with a kind of wild indifference. He'd lived through enough of them to recognize the warning signs. "Not tonight," he muttered. "Give me one night of peace." But nature didn't bargain. The wind sharpened by evening, rattling the windows of the house and moaning against the tin roof. Mason hurried back to the barn with a flashlight, its narrow beam slicing through the rising darkness. Dustwalker lifted his head when Mason entered, ears flicking toward the sound of the storm. The horse wasn't trembling yet, but his breathing had quickened, instinct warning him before the danger arrived. "It's just weather," Mason said softly. "We've seen worse." But even as he said it, he heard the barn walls strain against the wind's growing force. The structure had been old before he inherited it, and years of poor upkeep after the lawsuit had turned it fragile at the joints. Tonight, it felt like it might not hold. He reinforced what he could, sliding a feed bin against the weakest wall, latching the door twice, spreading fresh straw so Dustwalker would have softer footing if the night grew rough. The wind roared harder, hurling cold gusts into every gap between the boards. Thunder grumbled overhead. Dustwalker's whole body flinched. Mason knelt beside him, resting a hand on his neck. "You're safe. I'm right here." A moment passed. Then another. Lightning tore the sky open, and the barn lit up like a photograph, every crack, nail, and splinter outlined in a white blaze. Dustwalker jerked upright, legs trembling beneath him. Mason held his shoulder, grounding him. The next thunderclap hit so close the floor vibrated. "Easy," Mason whispered. The storm didn't care. Wind slammed the side of the barn with a howl so fierce Mason felt it hit his own ribs. The rafters groaned. Hay dust drifted from the loft above. The horse pressed against him, panic rising. Then came the sound he feared, the deep, grinding crack of wood giving way. "Damn it! Hold on!" The far corner of the barn splintered under the pressure. A beam dropped from the roof, smashing onto the ground in a burst of debris. Dustwalker tried to bolt, but his legs buckled halfway. Mason threw himself in front of the collapsing section, instinct overriding reason. He grabbed Dustwalker's halter and pulled him toward the opposite wall, out of the structure's failing path. Another gust hit. More boards cracked. The barn was coming down. "Move!" Mason shouted, voice raw. Dustwalker stumbled, nearly collapsing, but he managed a desperate half-step. Mason stayed beside him, gripping the halter with one hand and shielding the horse's head with the other. Thunder crashed again, shaking loose another beam. Then the back wall gave way entirely. Wind and rain exploded into the barn like a living thing. Dustwalker panicked, his weight stumbling into Mason, nearly knocking him off balance. Mason braced his legs and held on. "We're not losing everything tonight," he whispered fiercely. He guided the horse toward the last standing corner of the barn, small, barely safe, but more sound than the rest. Dustwalker's breath came in harsh bursts, nostrils flaring. The rain whipped into the open structure, soaking them both. Mason wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, shielding what he could from the flying splinters and slicing wind. A large section of the roof tore free and crashed outside, the noise violent, crushing, final. Dustwalker trembled all over. Mason buried his face against the animal's damp coat, refusing to let go. "We're okay. I've got you. Just stay with me." It wasn't a promise to the horse alone. Minutes passed. Long, ragged minutes filled with the roar of wind, the creak of breaking wood, and the pounding of Mason's heartbeat. But slowly, painfully, the storm began to relent. The thunder drifted farther away. The rain softened from rage to steady rhythm. The wind loosened its grip on the broken walls. By the time silence finally returned, Mason's arms were numb, and his clothes clung to him like frozen skin. Dustwalker sagged under his touch, exhausted but alive. When Mason stepped back to look at the damage, the breath caught in his chest. Half the barn lay in a shattered heap across the yard, a ruin of splintered beams and twisted metal. The place where Dustwalker had been lying that morning was crushed under the debris. If the storm had come 6 hours earlier, the horse would have never stood on those legs again, would have never had the chance to fight, to heal, to choose life. Mason swallowed hard. "You're still here," he whispered. "That's what matters." Dustwalker lifted his head and nudged Mason's shoulder. Weak, trembling, but intentional. They stood together in the wreckage, soaked to the bone, illuminated by the soft afterglow of a storm that had nearly taken everything. But it hadn't. Not tonight. When dawn finally came, it did not come quietly. It arrived like a breath held too long, slow, trembling, then suddenly full of color. Wyoming's sky stretched itself open across the horizon, soft pink breaking into gentle amber, as if the land had survived something it was still trying to understand. Mason hadn't slept. He sat on the ground beside it. Dustwalker, leaning against the one corner of the barn that still stood, his clothes stiff with dried rain, his hands scraped from wood and wire. Dustwalker had dozed fitfully through the last hours of the night, his body slumped with exhaustion, but his breathing steady enough to keep fear from tightening in Mason's throat again. Now, in the early light, the horse lifted his head and blinked, confused by the change in the world around him. The wreckage no longer looked like chaos. In the morning sun, the broken beams and collapsed metal glowed faintly, as if the storm had taken what it wanted and left behind something raw, but honest. "You made it," Mason whispered, pushing himself upright. The horse shifted, letting out a low, groggy sound. Mason brushed the dust from his palms and stepped forward to check Dustwalker's legs. They were stiff, trembling when he tried to move, but the spark in his eyes had not gone out. If anything, the night had deepened it. "Yeah," Mason murmured, his throat thick. "We both made it." He led Dustwalker slowly out of the ruined barn, guiding him through the debris field like a father leading a child across an unfamiliar street. The early sun warmed their backs as they moved onto open ground, clean, bright, and free of falling beams. Dustwalker stopped, sniffing the air with a curious hesitation, as if trying to understand why everything suddenly smelled fresher. The world had been washed clean. A breeze rolled over the property, sweeping through the plains with that renewal energy of life that comes only after a storm. Mason closed his eyes and let it touch his face. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he allowed himself something as simple as standing still, something as human as breathing deeply. When he opened his eyes again, Dustwalker stood a few steps ahead, looking toward the rising sun. His posture wasn't tall, not yet, but there was something new in the way he planted his hooves. A quiet grounding, a stubborn insistence on staying upright despite the night that had tried to bury him. "You're something else," Mason said softly. Dustwalker flicked an ear back at the sound, then took one small, deliberate step. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't strong. But it was forward. And for the first time since Mason had brought him home from the market, the horse lifted his head high enough to let the sunlight touch the scarred ridge of his neck. Mason felt the breath catch in his throat. "That's it," he murmured. "Take your time." He couldn't help noticing how Dustwalker stood differently now, like he wasn't just surviving, but choosing life. The emotional recovery happening in the space between man and horse wasn't dramatic or loud. It was slow, steady, like grass pushing through cracked earth. Mason walked to the water trough, filled it with fresh water from the pump, and watched Dustwalker approach. The horse drank with more purpose than before, not simply swallowing because he had to, but because he wanted to. Small victories, quiet, essential ones, felt like they were rebuilding something in Mason, too. Something he thought was gone for good. While Dustwalker drank, Mason scanned the ruined barn. The damage was worse than he remembered. Half the roof was gone. The support beams lay splintered, and one wall had completely vanished into the yard. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of reality settle back onto his shoulders. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. Rebuilding wasn't optional. Without shelter, Dustwalker wouldn't stand a chance against another Wyoming night. But rebuilding cost money. Real money, not the scraps left after bills, debts, and rural rebuilding expenses. Even emergency preparedness or storm insurance claims couldn't help him now. He'd lost coverage years ago when the lawsuit drained his accounts. Dustwalker looked up from the water, watching him. "What?" Mason said, half smiling. "You think I can just snap my fingers and fix all this?" The horse stepped forward, nudging Mason's arm. It wasn't the same gesture as before. It was firmer, more certain. Mason felt it like a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "All right," he whispered. "We'll figure it out." He walked back toward the ruined barn and lifted one of the fallen boards. It was heavier than he expected. His arms protested, but he moved it aside, then reached for another. And another. Dustwalker followed slowly, watching him with a quiet patience that made Mason's throat tighten. "This isn't just a barn anymore," Mason said aloud. "It's home. For both of us." Something shifted in the air. Something small and intimate. Dustwalker stepped even closer, his muzzle brushing Mason's sleeve lightly, as if agreeing. Mason paused and looked at him. "You know," he said softly, "I think you saved me last night as much as I saved you." Dustwalker exhaled, warm breath against Mason's arm. The morning wore on, and they cleared the space together. One lifting boards, the other simply standing nearby, as if his presence alone carried weight. By midday, the sky glowed bright blue, and the storm felt like a memory already fading. Dustwalker's steps grew steadier, and for the first time since he arrived, he took several in a row. Small, cautious strides, but undeniably strong ones. Mason felt something expand in his chest, something he hadn't dared to feel in years. Pride. Not just in the horse, but in himself, for holding on, for not letting the night swallow them both. "You're coming back," Mason whispered. "And maybe I am too." Dustwalker halted beside him, and together they gazed at the wide Wyoming plains, bright, open, full of breath. A new chapter of their lives was beginning, as gentle and steady as the morning sun. The Wyoming afternoon opened wide and warm, the kind of day that made the world feel honest again. Mason stood with one hand on Dustwalker's halter, the gentle breeze brushing past them, as if urging the two forward. The ground beneath their boots and hooves was soft, still damp from the storm days earlier, but firm enough to hold weight. Dustwalker had been walking longer distances through the yard, each step more confident than the last, as though something inside him had begun stitching itself back together. Now, with the sun leaning westward, Mason felt the quiet pull of a moment he didn't want to ignore. It was time. Not to push Dustwalker, not to demand anything, but to let him try. To give him the chance to remember what running felt like. "You ready?" Mason asked softly. Dustwalker flicked an ear, the small movement almost playful. His posture wasn't perfect, still narrow in the hips, still carrying shadows of exhaustion. But his eyes held a brightness that hadn't been there before. A steady glow. A want. Mason led him to the open field behind what remained of the barn. The land stretched all the way to the distant ridge, a narrow ribbon of gold where the sun touched the grasses. Dustwalker inhaled deeply, lifting his head. Something primal, something ancient and wild, stirred in him. "All right," Mason murmured. "Let's see what happens." He unhooked the lead rope, and stepped aside. For a moment, Dustwalker did nothing. He stood still, ears turning, the breeze tugging gently at his mane. Mason waited without a word. He knew enough about animal wellness and performance training to understand that patience wasn't optional. It was the whole foundation. You don't force broken things to move. You let them choose. Then Dustwalker shifted his weight. Just a shift. A small one. His hooves dug into the earth, testing it, feeling it. His breath steadied. And before Mason could speak, the horse took one step forward. Then another. Then a third. The steps became a slow walk, uneven but purposeful. Mason followed at a distance, hands in his pockets, heart heavier and lighter at the same time. He watched Dustwalker reach the center of the field, pause, and look back over his shoulder. "Go on," Mason encouraged. Dustwalker turned his gaze toward the horizon. The world held its breath. Then he ran. Not a sprint, not a gallop, just a run, a ragged, uneven, determined run. His hooves pounded against the ground like a heartbeat Mason hadn't heard in months. The horse's body, still thin and healing, moved with an emotional endurance that came not from strength, but from will. Mason felt something swell inside him, something warm and painful at once. His throat tightened. His eyes burned. Dustwalker ran farther, pushing through the open field as though he were trying to outrun every memory etched into his bones. The wind caught his mane, lifting it like a small banner. His back legs pushed harder, his stride lengthening. He stumbled once, regained balance, then kept going. "Attaboy," Mason whispered. "Attaboy," when Dustwalker finally slowed, his chest expanding with heavy breaths. Mason walked to him, giving him space to recover. Steam drifted from the horse's coat in the cool breeze. His head lowered, sweat gathering lightly at his withers. But his eyes, God, his eyes, shone with a brilliance Mason hadn't seen even in the healthiest horses. "You remember what it feels like," Mason said softly. "You remember who you are." Dustwalker stepped toward him, closing the distance until his muzzle pressed lightly against Mason's chest. Mason froze, then rested a hand against the horse's cheek. Dustwalker leaned into him, breath warm and steady. "Yeah," Mason whispered. "I'm right here with you." They stood in the middle of the field, the man and the $2 horse, bathed in the soft light of a Wyoming sunset. The world around them felt almost unreal. The gentle rustle of grasses, the far-off cry of a hawk, the smell of earth still remembering the storm. It felt like a place where things could begin again. "You ran," Mason murmured. "And you didn't need saving this time." Dustwalker lifted his head, as if taking pride in the words. Mason stepped back, watching the horse regain his breath, watching the slow rise and fall of his ribs. In the fading light, Dustwalker looked less like the creature who once lay dying in a market stall, and more like the horse he was always meant to be. Resilient, fierce, quietly magnificent. "You know," Mason added with a half-smile, "you might just be strong enough for the real thing someday. A real run. Maybe even a competition." Dustwalker snorted, tossing his head as though amused by the idea. Mason laughed quietly. "All right, not today, but you never know." A gust of cool wind swept across the field, brushing past them in a whisper. Dustwalker stepped closer again, nudging Mason's shoulder with a confidence he'd never shown before. Mason pressed his forehead lightly against the horse's, letting the moment settle deep inside him. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the plains. The day was ending, but something else was beginning. A new chapter, a new rhythm, a new understanding that the storm had not broken them, but shaped them into something stronger. "Let's head back," Mason said gently. They walked side by side across the field, the sky glowing orange behind them, Dustwalker's steps steady and full of promise. For the first time, Mason didn't just see survival in those steps. He saw possibility. The morning of the local charity race arrived with the kind of crisp air that made even the quietest towns feel alive. Wyoming's hills stood clear against a cloudless sky, and the dirt track outside Jackson Ridge shimmered beneath the early sun. Mason hadn't planned to enter Dustwalker, not really. It had started as a passing thought, one he dismissed again and again. But after watching the horse run across the field, something inside him refused to let the idea go. And somehow, almost without noticing, he found himself signing their names on the entry board for the annual outdoor competition. He didn't expect victory. He only wanted Dustwalker to feel the energy of moving with purpose, to be part of something bigger than the broken pieces of their pasts. As Mason led Dustwalker toward the starting area, conversations dimmed around them. People stepped aside, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief to something like pity. Dustwalker wasn't the sleek, muscled horses they were used to seeing at these events. He was still thin in places, still scarred, still bearing shadows of the creature who once lay dying in a dusty market pen. Someone murmured, "That's the $2 horse." Another whispered, "This can't be real." Mason kept walking. Dustwalker stayed close beside him, ears flicking nervously but eyes clear. The hum of the crowd, the unfamiliar smells, the bright flags flapping, all of it pressed against him at once. But he didn't shy away. Not this time. Something inside him had steadied over the weeks of healing and quiet rebuilding. He trusted the man beside him, and that was enough. At the starting line, Mason rested a hand against Dustwalker's neck. "We're not here to win," he said gently. "We're just here to finish. Whatever happens, you've already done more than anyone believed." Dustwalker nudged his shoulder, as if answering. The announcer called riders and handlers to take their places. Hooves pawed at the dirt. Saddles creaked. Dustwalker remained bareback, something Mason chose because he didn't want to weigh the horse down, not on this first real test. He stood at Dustwalker's side, prepared to run with him as long as the horse could manage. "All competitors," the announcer boomed. "This race is for community support and local event fundraising. Remember, sportsmanship first." The crowd applauded, though most eyes slid back to Dustwalker, some with amusement, others with quiet sympathy. A horn sounded, and the race began. The other horses bolted forward, hooves striking the ground in thunderous unison. Dustwalker flinched at the sudden burst of motion, instinct telling him to retreat. Mason touched his shoulder lightly, grounding him. "It's okay. Let's go at your pace." Dustwalker hesitated, then took his first step. It was small, uneven, but it was forward. Mason jogged beside him, matching his rhythm. The crowd watched in confusion as the two started last, moving slow enough to look almost out of place on the track. A few people laughed. One man folded his arms, shaking his head. But Dustwalker didn't stop. His stride grew steadier after the first bend, hooves finding comfort in the familiar cadence of movement. The air carried dust and sunlight, brushing memories awake inside him. Memories of running before cruelty, before hunger, before he'd been discarded for being too weak to matter. Mason breathed, with him, feeling each motion through his own bones. They passed the first quarter mark, far behind the pack, but Dustwalker gained a subtle rhythm, each step more confident. His ears perked, his chest expanded. Something flickered inside him, something like recognition, not of the track, but of himself. Halfway through the race, the unexpected happened. Dustwalker accelerated, not in a burst, not with speed that challenged the leaders, but with a controlled, determined increase. His stride lengthened, his breathing deepened. And for the first time that day, heads in the crowd turned not out of amusement, but astonishment. "That horse, he's actually moving." Who knew he had that in him? Mason didn't urge him forward. Dustwalker chose the pace himself. And Mason followed, heart pounding with a rising, quiet pride. They passed the rider who'd been thrown earlier, then another pair who had slowed to a walk. Dustwalker was no longer last. He wasn't first. But he wasn't last. By the final turn, Dustwalker's sides heaved, sweat darkening his coat. Mason kept a hand ready, speaking softly, letting the horse decide how far to push. Dustwalker, breathing hard but steady, lifted his head at the sight of the finish line. He refused to stop. The crowd fell silent as the two rounded the last stretch. Dustwalker's hooves kicked up small bursts of dust, and Mason found himself matching the horse stride for stride. Their breaths synced. Their movements synced. In that moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to a single rhythm. The rhythm of two creatures who had been broken, but refused to stay that way. When they crossed the finish line, far behind the winners but unquestionably finishing, something extraordinary happened. The crowd cheered. Not politely, not out of obligation, but with surprise. Respect. Something close to awe. The announcer, his voice crackling over the speakers, said, "Ladies and gentlemen, that is the $2 horse, and he just finished the toughest race of the season." Dustwalker slowed to a stop, shaking his mane. His sides expanded with heavy breaths, and his legs trembled with exhaustion. But he stood tall, taller than Mason had ever seen him. Mason rested a hand on his neck, voice that shaking. "You did it. You really did it." Dustwalker pressed his head against Mason's shoulder, the gesture full of quiet certainty. They hadn't won, but they had arrived. They had proved something unspoken. And for the first time in years, Mason felt the weight of the world lift. Because sometimes finishing was the victory. The applause from the race faded long before Mason and Dustwalker reached the ridge overlooking the valley. The crowd had dispersed, the dust had settled, and the track lay empty behind them. Yet Mason still felt the echoes of those cheers inside him, soft, lingering, almost unreal. The $2 horse had finished. He had crossed a line no one believed he could reach, and in doing so, he had given Mason something far more valuable than pride. He'd given him a way back to himself. The sky shifted into evening as the pair walked the familiar path up the hill behind Mason's property. The sun, low and amber, brushed the land with a warm glow that softened every fence post and blade of grass. Dustwalker's hooves made a slow, rhythmic sound against the ground, steady even after the race. He wasn't tired in the frightened, desperate way he once had been. His exhaustion now was earned, a gentle kind that came from giving all he had. Halfway up the hill, Mason paused to catch his breath, resting a hand on Dustwalker's shoulder. "Not bad for a horse they thought wouldn't make it," he said quietly. Dustwalker lifted his head, ears turning toward Mason as if he understood every word. The breeze tugged lightly at his mane, carrying the scent of sagebrush and cooling earth. Mason inhaled deeply. The air had a kind of peaceful living softness to it, a promise that the world could be kind when it wanted to be. They continued toward the crest, A place Mason used to visit years ago when life felt heavy but still hopeful. He hadn't gone there since the lawsuit, hadn't felt worthy of returning. But now, with Dustwalker beside him, the hill felt like home again, like a refuge waiting patiently for his footsteps. At the top, the land opened into a wide view of the Wyoming plains. Shadows stretched long across the valley, and the sinking sun cast a golden outline over Dustwalker's thin but sturdy frame. Mason stood beside the horse, silent, letting the moment settle. No noise, no demands, just breath, wind, and light. Dustwalker stepped closer, lowering his head gently against Mason's shoulder. It wasn't the desperate lean of a dying animal seeking support. It was quiet companionship, the kind built slowly, honestly, through fear and survival and small acts of trust. Mason closed his eyes. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think some people weren't meant to come back. That once you fell far enough, the only thing left was learning how to live with the fall." Dustwalker exhaled softly, warm breath brushing Mason's arm. "But you," Mason continued, voice low, almost breaking, "you showed me that coming back doesn't need to be loud. It can be quiet, slow. It can be just choosing to stand when no one expects you to." Below them, the valley glowed with the last light of day, the kind that makes a man think about everything he's lost and everything he might still be able to rebuild. The barn lay in ruins, but the land around it thrived in the evening glow. Maybe he'd rebuild it one wall at a time. Maybe he'd work with what he had instead of mourning what he didn't. Maybe rebuilding himself worked the same way. Dustwalker shifted, nudging Mason's arm again, an encouragement, or maybe a reminder that the world didn't end simply because it changed shape. Mason smiled, a small, tired smile that felt real, in a way smiles hadn't felt for years. "Guess we both learned something, huh?" The horse blinked slowly. Calm, grounded, unafraid. The stillness wrapped around them like a blanket. Mason had spent so many nights trapped in silence that hurt, silence that reminded him of failure. But this silence was different. This silence healed. He sank down on the grass, leaning back on his hands, watching as Dustwalker grazed nearby. The horse's movements were gentle, rhythmic, peaceful. Nothing like the trembling creature he had carried home from the market. Mason felt his chest swell with something warm and quiet. Not triumph, not victory, belonging. When Dustwalker raised his head again, the moon was beginning to lift itself above the horizon. The soft blue dusk washed over the land, turning the ridge into a place suspended between day and night. The horse wandered toward Mason and slowly lowered himself to the ground, folding his legs beneath him with care. Mason scooted closer, resting a hand against Dustwalker's neck. "Look at us," he whispered. "Two things the world didn't want. And here we are." Dustwalker breathed deeply, settling into the grass. They stayed like that for a long time, man and horse sharing warmth, breath, and silence. No noise from the town, no weight of judgment, just the quiet truth that healing didn't need applause to be real. It only needed time and presence and the stubborn refusal to give up. The moon rose higher, turning Dustwalker's coat silver. Mason let his hand rest there, feeling the steady rise and fall of life beneath his palm. "Thank you," he whispered. Dustwalker didn't move, but the slow blink of his eyes said enough. Mason looked out across the valley one more time. The world was still bruised, but beautiful. Broken, but open. Much like them. "Let's go home," he murmured at last. Dustwalker stood slowly, stretching his healing legs, then waited for Mason to rise. They descended the hill side by side, steps steady, shadows long. The night gathered gently around them, carrying them forward into whatever life waited next. Together. If this story touched something in you, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you'd like to join me for more quiet, heartfelt stories like this one, feel free to like the video and subscribe. There's always another journey waiting for us.